people will always just say, well, that's what you designed, can we have another one? Yes, yes.
So would you like, when you think about you want to study architecture?
Yeah.
So would you want to be a star architect, or do you want to be challenging that?
I think...
What have you got from this study in terms of your own understanding of your own creative direction?
I think I've learned that if I mean, everyone wants to be a little bit famous, like, that's true. I think in terms of like star architecture, I don't think from this I'd actually want to be famous for my individual. I don't think I'd want to be famous for my style. I'd want to be famous for the buildings I've designed. So rather than being known for, well, Sam designs white buildings, I'd want to be famous because I designed impressive buildings which had won awards, rather than just buildings that just happen to be similar to everything else I've done. Yes, Ed?
Do you think that there's a point where the design of cities will become so universal that tourism is then affected adversely because of the fact that people only have to travel within the boundaries of the city that's closest to them to see examples of architecture that's all around the world?
I think to an extent, yes, but I don't think you'll ever be able to escape the original. So I don't think you will ever be able to get away from the fact that I want to go to Rome. I don't want to see a replica of Rome, because to see the original version of it is much more impressive than seeing the copy of it. But I think it will put people off of spending extortionate amounts of money to go and see it, because they can experience it much cheaper and much closer. Ollie?
You're saying that it's sad that cities are losing their sort of individuality, but don't you think that's more of a focusing more on the new buildings that are coming up, rather than really, if you're sort of on the street in London, you will still be able to tell that you're in London depending on like the buildings and the other style of architecture that's come before, these sort of star architect type buildings. I mean, it's sort of the level of homogenisation is sort of depending on the newer buildings rather than the buildings that have been there for a while, so you can still be able to tell.
So the reason I've put the CCTV headquarters up is, before this was built, what was there was original, authentic Chinese architecture. And there's a limited amount of space in a city, and there's a limited amount of space that people want to build in a city. And I think, while you're right, it will get to a point where the desire to design a new building becomes so great that we actually start demolishing what was there before, which is when it gets really... that's when it gets to the point where it's not interesting anymore, because you're removing what was actually exciting about that city to build something new. So I think, as long as you don't lose the core of the city, you will be able to identify it, which, yeah, you will. But if you start demolishing what was there before, you start losing the heart of what that city was in terms of the architectural identity of it. Ben?
In the future, where do you see this going? Do you think there's going to be continued homogenisation, or do you think architects are going to try and fight this to keep the individuality?
I think, in terms of what comes next, I think the key part about this is the architect does have some responsibility to say, well, I'm going to design depending upon what the city's like, which is what they should do. I think there should also be some form of development from like city planners and politicians to ensure that cities don't become homogenised. So they should put in some sort of restrictions or design principles which have to be followed for that city, so that it remains identifiable. I also think, weirdly, because China is now so I use China as an example a lot because it works, but because China is now so economically powerful, and so is America, the system of you'll be judged on how close to America you are, I think, is going to fade. And what that means is the people who now have money in China are not necessarily from a Western society, so they will not necessarily push for Western architecture. So you might actually get the opposite effect, where things start to change more because you've got more people with money. So people always talk about the 1%, which is the richest sort of top slice in the world. Over time, because the population is growing, that 1% will also grow, which means there's a greater diversity within that 1% who can therefore afford to build. So you will get a greater diversity of people who can afford to pay for new architecture, which in turn gives you greater diversity in what is built. Adam.
In your conclusion, you said how you think that economic reasons are the main reasons for new architecture and like new buildings coming around.
Yeah.
Don't you think that culture and also like sort of climate would change? Because if you used America and Dubai, they both got very different cultures, different laws, rules, and also the climate's very different.
Yeah, so that does have an implication on the architecture, but with 21st century technology, buildings now no longer have to take account of the climate because you've got air conditioning and stuff like that. So that's one reason, but also the way cities are now designed is sort of isolated from actually the country they're in. So you could probably pick up a city in two different locations and interchange them, and they would probably still work as the individual city, no matter where they are. That's sort of the point. In terms of like big scale architecture, I mean like localised housing and stuff is always going to have differences because like you can't live in the same building in Antarctica as you can in Dubai. But in terms of the big infrastructure and the big consistent buildings, they are very interchangeable between cities, which is what I think is slightly sad because you no longer have these big buildings which represent the city they're in. They're just big buildings. Yes, Miss.
You've answered a lot of questions about the content research, but just to finish off, in terms of your research projects, you talked about that one source which had a significant impact, Robert Adam. I know from supervisor meetings that was a challenge that you had to face to substantiate your arguments with different sources. Can you give me an example of an aspect of your line of reasoning where you were able to draw in from a different research base?
When I was writing my essay, I started off with a plan with all my points, and then I put in quotes from the sources. But when I did that initial plan, I didn't use that source at all. I used every other source I had, and then afterwards I filled in the gaps with that source to ensure that it had the breadth and depth of research which it required. So, for example, Anthony D. King was a key sort of writer who I used for the Global Society, but I also used him to cross-reference stuff with economics. And then I used the Architectural Review, which is a magazine written by architects and architectural critics, as well for the economics, because they have a lot of sources on that as well. So I got a lot of different opinions to ensure that it had the breadth and depth that it needed.